Hello there, and welcome to part 2 of the short mini-series, What's a Social Enterprise and Why Do I Care? Today we're going to be looking at what does it mean to me? If you haven't seen the first one, please do check it out. I think today's content will make a lot more sense if you do watch the first one, and it's got some really helpful background and everything around the types of social enterprise and how we arrived at those. And as with the first one, I'm joined by Adrian Ashton and Anita Toze, so thank you for joining me. And I think before we get into too much, just to be good to have a quick recap, because even if you did watch it, you might not remember all of the details, and it's always helpful for me to have a recap about what we talked about in the first one. And so the thing we first spoke about was what we actually mean by social enterprise. And the conclusion we came to was it was an organization which trades and uses its assets in order to do good things and in an ongoing way. So are there any other bits that you really want to, either of you would like to add to that particularly?
No.
Okay, cool. I mean, I think it's a useful thing to continue using as a comparison, and it's all of those things, because there are different aspects, and we'll get back to that later in the show, that you can do with other organisations, but it's the bringing it all together that makes it a social enterprise. And I just want to briefly share about why it's worth listening to us talking about this. So from my perspective, I work with I'm an innovation guide, so I work with brand new ideas and bringing ideas out into the world, and very many of them are around social entrepreneurship and social change. So this is my particular interest in this, and with Anita, I'm also in the process of setting up our own social enterprise. So yeah, Anita, could you share a little bit, very briefly, about your role in all this?
Thank you. Yes, so I work as a psychotherapist, and as well together with Matthew, looking into develop a social enterprise, and going to probably be looking more at our example in episode 3. And I think the sort of we are looking at this in a more holistic way, not only from a legal and business point of view, but as well what it means to be a human being, what it means to take on this challenge, actually on a very personal level. So stay with us.
Cool, thank you. And Adrian.
And I'm Adrian. And, well, it depends who you ask as to what you hear about me. I tend to find myself, though, working with lots of charities and businesses and community groups around what Matthew would term wicked problems. So that sense of a group of people have come to something and saying, this seems too complicated. Well, we don't understand even how to begin asking the question about it to figure out. And one of those themes is around legal structure for a social enterprise, because there's over a dozen options with lots of different regulators and lots of implications as it goes through. And people think, and so they feel they rush it or fluff it. And what I find I can do, or people tell me that I've been able to help them to do, is to approach it in a way that they suddenly feel they understand it now. They feel they can be confident in making that decision. And like Anita was saying, this is about this approach that we take between us all. It's about the people involved in it as well. It's not driven by the process. It's not driven by the task or the function. It's driven by the needs, desires, and feelings of us as human beings, and how on that basis we engage with these ideas and work them out together.
Thank you. And I think, this idea of if we're trying to create a truly human-centered organization, that's going to work all the way through from the foundations upwards, and this series being concerned with really those foundations is a really really big part of it. If you're if you're already trying to fit a model that doesn't quite work for you, it's not going to be the best of starts. And we looked in the first episode about all of the different legal forms and covered all of those and the histories and the implications and how they all play out, and looked at why it's difficult to pick, and found out quite how many reasons there were. And we also challenged a few of the very common myths out there. So it's really, a lot of this is about challenging preconceptions. The work is fundamentally about challenging preconceptions, but we might, as as people planning to start a social enterprise, have to challenge a few of our own as well, which, I guess is only fair if we're going to go out there and do that for everyone else. So so today what we're going to do is look at the particular problem of there just being so many choices out there, and how we can engage with them, and what we can control, what we can engage with, what we do know now, instead of trying to have all the answers ahead of time, which is definitely not possible when you're working with complex work. So the first kind of area of these choices is, what do I want to do? Where does that all fit in? So Adrian, do you want to share a bit more about that side of the decision-making process and narrowing it down?
Yeah, for sure. So we thought we'd kind of take the idea of this session as discrete types of approaches. So rather than introduce one simple framework or tool, saying there are lots of ways that people come at this, and then to help you sift through those and reflect on what's going to be right for yourself and your community and your situation. And very often I think the starting point should be, ideally, what's in your own heads now? How do you want this enterprise that you're creating to work? What's there in terms of your preferences? What's important to you as the founders, as your community? And then finding a form that matches into that. So for example, if you're thinking, actually, the way that I want to do this and set this thing up is to offer as much as possible for free at point of contact with people. So I know I'm going to need lots of grant funding to help me do that. We're in control of these aspects. We decide this is how I want it to work, how I want it to proceed. So we're thinking, okay, we want it to be free at point of delivery. And we may have looked around and said, well, actually, we're going to struggle to get that commissioned as a public service. So we know we're going to need grant funding and gifts and philanthropy. And if that's the case, then we say, well, actually, a charity form is probably going to suit that best. It increases your odds, and it helps you work in that model in terms of how you want to work it. Or you may decide, actually, what I want to do is actually be quite lean, quite at risk of drifting into the jargon, agile, responsive. I'm going to be in a marketplace where things move quickly. So I need a legal form that actually helps me flex to adapt really quickly. So on that basis, a simple company has the most flexibility over your current and your future options and abilities to trade with. So it's that idea, start with what you know now, what's important to you and what's important to your model. And then you start to sift out to look at some of those options.
And I think the other big source of information to help kind of sift through all of those choices is look at what other people do, and compare and see how that goes. So we're going to be looking also at, how other people have approached this and what happens when they do, as well as looking at a model for our own experience and to kind of narrow it down. Because for me, it's about the overlap. It's about the intersection between these things. It's about finding something that works with both of these aspects, rather than feeling that there's some kind of tension between the two.
Yeah. If I can just add maybe a bit of a reflection. It's really about going back and forth in this decision-making process. It's sort of having a more limited amount of information when starting. Okay, so as Adrian said, okay, where what do I want to do? And then sort of as you answer those questions, you kind of go, okay, I need to read a bit more about this. And as you start there, it's going to take you down a route and you're going to be led towards other information. So it is really a process of going back and forth, and it's okay to not have all the answers, and initially that won't be there. It's really a very explorative process.
I think that kind of echoes what you were showing at the start of episode 1 earlier, Matthew, which was you and Anita have come at this subject in the past and struggled to make head or tail of it. It's kind of, how do we engage this? Because it's all presented as being very factual. This form does this, that form does that. And we're left thinking, well, is that good or bad? I don't know. and actually the idea of this series, as we're working through it, is to help frame those questions better, so that when you look at that guidance out there, like Anna was saying, it's much more of an iterative process. I think I need to know more about how can that form help me do this way, and then it's okay, that clarifies that, and it's giving me another question. So how do I now bounce this backwards and forwards? But then, as you say, Anita, we were chatting earlier, one of the challenges is that takes headspace. That takes kind of mental brain processing power. And we may feel that actually we don't have enough of that for all sorts of reasons, with everything else going on as we're starting up a new venture, that we need a quicker answer. So that point, well, what do other people do? Maybe I'll just imitate them.
And there's no, you have the resources that you have. And I think this idea of finding a perfect answer, knowing exactly, being completely sure about everything, it's not necessarily desirable to spend all of the resources, even if that is at all realistic or possible, to come to that. Sometimes it's better just to get started and start trying things. But you want to be fairly confident that you're heading off in a reasonable direction. You're not going to drop off a cliff very shortly after you've embarked on your journey or hit some impassable barrier. So I think for me, getting that confidence to start exploring and get out there is really the end goal of this, rather than being like, yes, one particular form will serve whatever you're trying to do for the rest of history.
Yeah.
So I'd like to just move it on and have a look at what people actually do. How do people actually approach this? Because it makes sense to look at what people have done before, right? And see what else is done. So, Adrian, could you talk us through some of the stuff on this one, please?
The glorious Technicolor rainbow of the charts that's now on screen, and we have the nice people at Social Enterprise UK to thank for this, because every couple of years they do a state of the sector piece of research, and they map out what's happening across social enterprise land, not just in terms of the identities, but also future aspirations, innovation, growth, accessing finance, employing people, diversity, lots of really great information to benchmark yourself against and think, what should we be expecting ourselves to be able to do as a social enterprise if we're part of this wider community? And I'm always interested in this first chart that they have, because it's an initial data capture that says, what's your legal form? As a social enterprise in the UK, what are you using? Now, Social Enterprise UK have done State of the Sector on a few cycles now. And what I find interesting is that top choice, the most popular choice, 1/3 or thereabouts of all social enterprises say, we are a company limited by guarantee. And as we picked up in episode 1, there's probably historical reason for that, going back to 1985. But interestingly, there's sometimes, in terms of underneath that, the other legal forms kind of move up and down a little bit, jostle for position. But every time the report comes out, CLG, company limited by guarantee, is always clearly the first choice. And I'm kind of wondering how much of that is because people are saying this is, having researched them all, the best option for us, or as we've just been reflecting on, we don't have the headspace to be thinking about this properly, or we don't know the questions we should be asking. So we look at what everyone else is doing and we say, oh, everyone else seems to be doing this, so there must be something in it. Let's do that as well. Let's kind of imitate what we see as being successful. So this is an interesting benchmark, but it kind of says, if you're in a hurry, if you want that reassurance, because the choice we make for our legal form has implications. We're liable for it. We're responsible for it. It will, as we'll kind of explore as we go on today in this session, it informs what you can and can't do in accessing finance, or your credibility with different audiences. So actually having a starting point like this is really useful, and it gives us a sense of, as a new social enterprise, what are we coming into? And as we talk with other social enterprises, what are they probably already thinking as well, to help us make sense of the conversations we're going to be having with them?
And I think it's a really interesting thing to think about when you're looking at any set of figures like this is how alike are the companies that make up each of these to the thing that we have in mind. Because, as we discussed in the first episode, there's such a range of different things that fall under the kind of the banner of social enterprise, that actually, looking to those that are similar to you is another useful way of slightly narrowing down this field. But I'd like to move on to how people do typically decide, and have a look at some of the and then start to have a look at some of the pitfalls of that process as well.
If I may just maybe a little bit going back, I'm just sort of thinking about the viewer, whether how familiar they would be with the terms and all that, whether we should give a bit of a short, just a very, very brief short explanation of the main ones and sort of legal forms maybe that we can see.
Yeah, should we do it? Yeah, that's a great idea. Let's see. I think for people the top
That's very
few.
good, really, the top few.
Yeah, sounds yeah. So Adrian, could we? Yeah, could you talk us through the top few?
Unfortunately, we can cluster these as well. So it's a bit like beer. Beer is beer, but it comes in lots of different variants depending what mood you're in and how strong you want it to be. So as a quick, hopefully a summary recap from that section we played in episode 1, we have limited companies by guarantee or by share. So straightforward, limited company. We register it with Companies House, and it gets on and it does stuff. Companies House say, right, get on, keep it legal, but do what you think you need to do. That's it. And we can adapt it slightly to protect that social purpose and those resources that it creates to keep doing good into the future.
And looking at that graph, that's just under half of all social enterprises as straightforward companies of one form or another. Yeah.
And then in addition to that, we have the idea of a community interest company, a KIC. As we kind of touched upon last time, community interest company is a legal status that government introduced as part of its commitment and interest to growing and supporting and nurturing the broader wellspring of social enterprise. So a KIC is not a standalone legal form. It's a layer on, it's a bolt on to an existing company. So that's why we see some of those entries saying we're just a company limited by guarantee, or we're a KIC company limited by guarantee. So there's some extra fiddly bits that they've engineered into it through that interest.
So in a way, yeah. So in a way, the sort of as we speak about the company limited by guarantee, it can have a social purpose and cannot have a social purpose. And then when we speak about the KIC, then they make a statement that there is that social purpose, and there's a bit more regulation around that.
There's additional regulation that they subject themselves to. To protect
and the two are quite closely related, aren't they? Because a KIC is a company with a kind of bolt-on. Rather than it's the same kind of underlying form, but with an extra bit, an extra set of responsibilities, rather than a fundamental.
So that bolt-on part is you have to take them all as they are. That's it. No negotiation. Alternatively, all of those aspects, any of those other non-KIC companies can choose to adopt and have within their legal identity as a limited company, and be protected by Companies House. Although again, as we kind of go through this particular episode, the role of the regulator is really key in this. So Companies House will simply say, we'll be in the background, we'll keep a watching brief. If you've asked us to protect that social purpose, then it can still be changed, but you'll have to jump through an awful lot of hoops to let us allow you to change it. As a community interest company, the KIC regulator has far more extensive powers, and if it thinks that company is starting to act out not quite right, it can step in a very powerful way and say, no, those directors are not the people, they're not acting in interest, those directors are gone, or that trading activity isn't actually that properly aligned to your social purpose, so we're going to make you stop doing that now. So there's much more kind of a what would legally be called a prudential role. They can tell you what you can do, who should be involved in doing it, than Companies House can.
Mm.
And for some, that protection is really important. It gives them that assurance in terms of succession, things changing in the future. We know that vision will always be protected. For others, they say, actually, that's too constrictive. How, if we feel we need the flexibility, how can we be confident we can have it in the same way we would in a company, but we're not sure how far the regulator as a kick will let us be able to exercise that as things change over time.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify as well, the CIC cannot become a charity. It says in a charitable.
A CIC cannot be a charity,
yeah,
but it can transform into a charity. So
it
there is
can
a legal
transform.
process that says if a community, if a body of people have said we've registered as a kick, and then we realize, oh, maybe this wasn't quite the right choice after all, maybe we should have been a charity. There is a process that the kick can subject itself to, can apply to, that will, the kick regulator and the charity commissioners talk together and they move you. They move your legal form from a kick to a charity. So it changes like a butterfly.
I think it's an important point.
So it's just one of those few choices, one of those very few options where you can change from one to another in a relatively straightforward way. But as we heard last week, we picked up last week, there is no ever probably ideal legal form that will always cover everything you need it to forever and ever. So it's worth revisiting these questions. Say, even if we've been registered or incorporated for a decade, it's still worth just checking every so often, is this still the right form in allowing us to work in the way that we want and to relate to our community the way that we should be?
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that charity is not on this list. And that's another form that can also be taken. So
I think this is the interesting thing as well. So this will come on to, because when Social Enterprise UK do this mapping, they take it from the results of survey forms. So this chart that often gets referenced and cited by a lot of advisors and other social entrepreneurs out there, this is on the basis of social enterprises who have self-identified as such and sent the forms back, which is why we've kind of got these sole proprietorship, because as we identified in the last episode, you cannot actually pass the acid test to prove that you are a legitimate social enterprise unless you are incorporated in some way. A sole proprietor means you're self-employed. If you're self-employed, you cannot tick the boxes of what it means to be a social enterprise. But this mapping that Social Enterprise UK do is based on, this is what the sector send back. And I think it's interesting to say, this for me shows something of the pipeline of what's happening. How many social enterprises are emerging as fully formed, spitting out to the world, and how many are coming from existing private businesses, be they sole traders or privately owned companies with shares, and are saying, we want to move more into this identity of how we work for the impact we can create.
Absolutely. I think, when we're starting to, look at use this information, essentially, is we're very much looking at what peers have done in this, and seeing who has done that, and it's all filtered through the central bodies, the Social Enterprise UK and other advice groups, to make that decision. But for me, I think we just like you say, we have to take this kind of information. We have to be a little bit careful with it and how we interpret it. It's not immediately transparent, and just because I think by my maths, like nearly 90% of all organisations were companies of some form or another, that immediately means, well, that's the only sensible option. And this is particularly true for me when we're looking at these complex problems and we're looking at doing something genuinely innovative, is that there probably isn't direct precedent. You can look at other organisations and say, okay, well, they're a bit like us. And then this one's a bit like us. But neither are going to, there's not going to be that really good fit. And that was one of the big challenges we personally faced when we started looking around for forms, was all of the advice was for very simple kinds of organisations that didn't actually map to our our experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something about that. And I think we kind of talked to this in terms of the visual prompts that we've set ourselves up for these conversations, Matthew and Anita, with the slide decks we've got. That of testing the data. Because I think if I remember right in our slide order, the next slide is a chart that kind of expounds upon that idea a bit more about what we test and see, which is, like you've said, Social Enterprise UK, the word charity doesn't appear in that list. It has in previous state of the sectors, but not in this current one. But then that's the Social Enterprise UK asking people who they think are social enterprises, how do you identify? We then see other mapping being done by other sector bodies. And they say, well, we've looked at it from a regulator's perspective. So we've kind of gone out to the Charity Commission, to Companies House, to the FCA, to the KIC regulator, and looked for social enterprise types in there from that actual empirical data set, and then kind of found a slightly different picture.
Mm-hmm. It is a bit of a, knowing that sort of how it was for me looking into this as well. And I think, me and Matthew, we've done that. And it was kind of, it started a little bit, they're companies, you can become a company and you can kind of have a more social or less social purpose. But then looking really at sort of SEO social enterprise in general and the more regulated versions. And I think we started to look into that more, and KICS was one of those. And then, learning, so that there are certain legal structures that, can be charitable as well. And that kind of led us to more, let's look at the options, for charities, what's there, like CIO or charitable incorporated organization. So I guess this is the process of how we really explored a little bit more about, what's out there. And I think I just want to as well encourage the viewer to say, starting somewhere is good as the information will kind of arrive slowly as one explores.
And I think for me, I feel, there is a sense of pressure in making these decisions, and there's a time pressure, and you don't want to do it wrong, and kind of responsibility to the community and to yourselves, and all of that is quite a lot to kind of process and deal with. And I think for me, a lot of the difficulties, if we hand over the responsibility to someone else, it's kind of, then it's not our fault. Whereas actually being able to really connect with this stuff and connect with our own needs and the community needs and the intent gives us something that's going to work hopefully over the longer term, which is very much the intent, instead of just essentially that straightforward, it's one of these, tick the box, then it's definitely one of these, which feels like a very risky way to approach things, because you might well hit a dead end there.
Yeah, and that phrase, Matthew, of we just want to hand it over to someone else, is actually really dangerous. Because one of the things I always say to people is, again, if someone else is suggesting to you, you should be this legal form for what you do, that's okay. Like Anita says, test it, wait it, go and do some reading around it first, and then come loop back round again. But I always say to people, you will be registering, you will be creating this legal form, you will be signing for it, not the advisor, not the other social enterprise. They walk off. If they've given you bad advice on this, if they've misunderstood something about your model or your aspirations, you're stuck with it legally, they're not.
Yeah.
So never be afraid to push back on advice you're being offered, to say, okay, you've pointed to that chart, but what else? And help me understand it. And how does that relate to me? And like you said, why don't I see some of the normal other legal forms I thought we could do on that? And always have that question in mind.
So absolutely, and I think the consequences and seeing how these things play out is what's often not shown in these other graphs, and this is really the next bit for us to get to and have a bit of a look at how this does work. So could you talk us through what we're looking at in this graph, Adrian?
Yeah, so this kind of just highlights or illustrates the idea we were saying earlier about when we look at data, when we ask other people what are they doing, it's always going to be biased in some way. Social Enterprise UK have their state of the sector chart. which is fine and brilliant, but it's biased because the data that they report comes from social enterprises that they've identified and sent the survey form to. And it's not been tested. They don't test the data when it comes back. So a couple of years ago, NCVO, the National Council of Voluntary Organisations, every year they produce a really rich data source called the Almanac. And the Almanac looks at the broader charity, non-profit, community sector, social sector, third sector in its entirety. And a couple of years ago, part of the Almanac looked at what are the legal forms that we see at play in this space, across the whole space. Organizations that are set up to be doing good. They're not businesses, they're not government, but they're doing good in lots of different ways, and increasingly through trading. And unlike Social Enterprise UK, NCVO went to the regulators and said, what's the data set from that side? And the idea of this chart is just to do a simple compare and contrast. And what it kind of suggests is, if we ask what are the most commonly chosen forms for social enterprises from the perspective of Social Enterprise UK, it's a company limited by guarantee. And then charities and kicks kind of running in second and third place. If we ask the NCVO, what are the most commonly used legal forms for social enterprises and organizations doing good in their communities, overwhelmingly it's charities, and companies are far distant second. Kicks negligible by comparison as well. So there's something interesting here about, again, where we take our information from, who we're asking, and how far we take that at face value, and how far we try and get better at asking questions about it to assure ourselves we've taken the right understanding from it for our situation. You know, Anita, as Matthew, you were saying, you've taken the right understanding as it applies to what you're trying to create within the way you want to progress it and put it out there.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think so much of this, words become very difficult in this space because social enterprise, you know, if you say it clearly, you know, this data perhaps reflects the fact that not every organization that wants to do good identifies itself as a social enterprise. They just don't describe themselves that way. And so they don't show up in one set of data, whereas they do in the other set of data.
And I know, for example, over the years, I've been approached through a number of these kind of sector mapping surveys, nationally and regionally, and saying, oh yeah, you know, we'd like you to share the information about your business model for our social enterprise survey. And I say, but why are you asking me? And they say, because you're a social enterprise. And I say, but I'm not. What makes you think I'm a social enterprise? And they say, well, on the basis of what we see, how your business behaves. How your business behaves from the outside looks indistinguishable from how a social enterprise should be acting. Which, again, that sense, that blurring the edges of saying you can do good and not be a traditional social enterprise model. So there's something about how that confusion blurs even more.
So to try and kind of pick apart a bit more of this confusion, I want to maybe break it down into start to break this down into things we can know and understand, and start to get a bit get some traction on actually making a decision, coming to a decision, because we've having said at the end of the first episode that we were going to kind of simplify everything and bring it down. What we've just done is made it even more complicated. So to start breaking it down, we've got we've really got the underlying kind of factors that you're going to be considering, that you want to be thinking about, and having an answer to, coming to an answer to, for each of the of each of the models and what you're expecting. So the first one of these is how you plan to actually do good. So how does this play out?
So this is pretty much within your control as a body of entrepreneurs setting something up. This is about how do you see your social enterprise model working day to day in how it's going to trade and do things. And normally when I'm speaking with groups about this, I make a reference to a paper that was produced a number of years ago by Charities Aid Foundation called The 3 Models of Social Enterprise, which I think is a really great primer. Now, you can look it up separately, but just to give you the kind of the rough and ready version of it now and how that relates to here. Charities Aid Foundation say whatever your legal form, whatever your trading is, whatever your social purpose is, social enterprises will only manifest in one of 3 ways. There will be what's called the step model. And that step model says we're working in a way that says the more we do of the activity, the more good directly happens. For example, community energy. The local community will come together, pool their funds, put up some wind turbines. The more turbines they put up, the more we divest from fossil fuels, the more money comes back into the community. Okay? So on that basis, we probably need a legal structure that allows that local community to retain ownership of it and to make sure that money flows back into that community in the most efficient way. The second model that Charities Aid Foundation postulated was the trade-off model. And this is where I think most social enterprises sit, the trade-off model that says we have purposefully limited or constrained our efficiencies and our potential to generate cash or profit because of how we are running the business day to day. For example, we are going to create as much employment as we can for people who've been affected by homelessness or who are recovering veterans from the military. That means those people's productivity compared to someone we can get straight out of college will be lessened. Their support needs will be higher. But that's part of our mission, our desire to do good. So we probably need a legal form then that allows us some flexibility and leeway to drawing in revenues and financial support other than straight trading, but not exclusive. And then the third model that Charities Aid Foundation postulated was what was called the unrelated business model. And this says, as a social enterprise, you've come across something that makes an absolute bucket of money. You know, it just, you can't imagine how much money you can make out of this. Bottled water, for example, generates huge amounts of profit in terms of those operators who are in that space. But maybe the actual product is not that sound in itself. But as the social enterprise, you say, well, we'll engage with that marketplace because there's money to be had from it, and we will take all that profit that we can generate, max it out, and then pump all of that profit into something unrelated from our core trading activity. Community education projects, for example.
And so this could also be
that minimizes the tax and maximizes the way to pull profit out to push it that way.
And this, I guess, this also falls into, say, merchandising in general. You know, where a lot of charities make some of their income through merchandising and selling. You know, that isn't directly related, but it helps support the ongoing efforts and the work of the organisation.
So for charities can trade. Okay, let's try to be clear about this. Charity law says you can trade, and if you trade, then you're not trading to make a profit, so you don't pay corporation tax. Lovely. But there are rules and hard lines around what is permitted as trading. And that trading has to directly relate to your charitable purpose and has to directly involve the people who are benefiting from your charity. If it doesn't, then there's a cap on it. There's limits. So you can be creative. Absolutely. You can do some bits in that space, max out the trading, and then, as we picked up on last time, potentially set up a group structure. So a lot of charities, you see, the larger charities have what are called trading subsidiaries. Charities own private businesses because they've said that allows us to generate lots of cash and profit that we can sweep back into the main charity to keep delivering on that core charitable purpose.
Okay, yeah, this is something as well I came across, sort of such as a charity having sort of perhaps a CIC on the side as a charity shop or any other form.
Sounds a bit rude, doesn't it? We have a CIC on the side.
So yeah, there are ways to kind of build it as a sort of network, really, of legal structures rather than just having one. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah.
Yeah, and this does relate back to, well, the wants and needs of the community and of the founders and whoever's working in the area, and that's a really important factor in this, and kind of an often overlooked one, I think, in this space. Actually, this idea of there just being a problem and therefore we should do something about it, rather than actually directly connecting with what we want to do about it, what's actually in our interest, and because that, for me, that's a big part of making something sustainable and that it's going to last and have the right kind of impact. So that's the next stage. Yeah.
Again, that point about your needs as the entrepreneurs founding this thing. Now, for some people, some people may be in a very privileged position and say, we don't need to draw a salary from this. We can simply devote our time to it because we're fortunate enough and blessed enough to have the resource we need, the support we need from elsewhere to pay the rent, to keep the fridge topped up. Brilliant. Okay, rightly or wrongly, I have no problem with that, because it means that you can then create something which has less financial demands to be able to achieve the good. But it's equally fine if a body of people have come together and said, we want to go out and fix this issue, meet this need. However, we need to pay our rent at some point through this. So we need to create a model and a legal form that allows us to be paid. And if we're saying we as the founders want to be in a governance role within this as well, so as a board or management committee, and we need to be paid through it, then that kind of knocks out the charity form. Because a tenet of charity law says the trustees of a charity should not, to put it crudely, be employed by it. It's too much of a vested interest. It's too conflicted. A company or a kick, however, says no problem. There's a conflict of interest, but it's relatively straightforward to resolve that and to put a note in your governing documents, in your company rules, and then introduce a simple practice, and it's dealt with. And you can work it that way. So it's, that point of what's important to you as the people setting this up in terms of what you need. And I always say to people, be as honest as you can. I'm not your priest or your God or your bank manager, but you'll have to answer to them at some point. But I'm not bothered if you tell me you need £5,000 a month out of this, or no money a month out of this. We need to know that so we can help you navigate these options and these pathways to figure out how does this best get out there in a way that does good in the world, and in a way that doesn't mean you fall over and cripple yourself in the process.
Absolutely. And relatedly, then there's others' expectations and the expectations around the model that we choose and how other people see it and relate to it.
And I always kind of say that there's a story that I share around this, which is a kind of a social enterprise years ago, or nascent social enterprise. The term wasn't really that commonplace then. And they'd been having a conversation with the head of economic development in their local council, being primed to kind of engage in this big, brilliant partnership, would have unleashed so much stuff. And they kind of were just checking off some boxes. And the head of economic development said, "Oh, but you're not a charity. I thought you would be a charity, and that because if you're not a charity, that means we can't work with you." Because the council had never worked with groups in this way before who were not charities. And the group sat there, blinked, and said, "Oh, we don't know. We don't know why we're not a charity. We were told a while ago this would be an okay form for us." And so they felt stupid, looked stupid, lost the confidence of the council, and a couple of years later, the whole thing just wound up and just petered out. But around that time, I was having a conversation with them in the immediate aftermath. I said, but hang on a minute, your legal form, being a charity, would have meant you couldn't have operated in the way that you needed to. In terms of that flexibility of trading, the way that you involve people on the board, in terms of the different roles in the governance design. And you could still do it in a way that satisfies that acid test of social enterprise and mapped against how the council could engage with you. It's just that form wasn't right, but this form isn't. Oh, and they sat there and went, oh, we forgot that. Yeah, we probably should have said that at the time, shouldn't we? So I'm always keen to, if your the thing you're setting up, if you know there is an audience or an officer or someone outside of you whose support will be crucial in helping you in that contract, getting into that partnership, reaching a community, have a conversation with them first and say, what do you think we should be? We're not guaranteeing that's what we'll be, but if we understand any prejudice or bias you might have because of things you've heard or maybe misunderstood, we can fix that now before it becomes a problem.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you, Adrian, as well for the example. I think sort of to, kind of a bit of a real life feel to what it means, maybe answering these questions. Yeah, why are we actually doing this way rather than another way? And I think some of those questions are best to be answered as well as once fully in, as I think what you mentioned as well previously. And I think Matthew as well, you spoke about that it's about, starting really, and sometimes that might mean changing the structure and sort of transitioning to another one later on if needed and necessary. And some of the questions we can only answer once we're sort of in operating.
I think part of that is in terms of, if we wait until we have all the answers figured out, we'll never do anything because there'll always be something else. I think the point is there's, I mentioned it last time, sociocracy. There's a tenet in sociocracy that says it just has to be good enough for now and safe enough to try. If we can get to the point of saying, we think this choice best ticks our boxes on the basis of what we know now, and we feel comfortable with what we're going to be making ourselves accountable to in terms of the regulator above us. We'll mention we'll touch upon the regulator a bit more through this episode. In terms of, are they the right regulator we want to be beholden to? Then let's go for it. And we'll give it a road trial, and we can try and adapt it in the future if we need to.
And it brings us to the last of the decision factors, really, which is legislation and what, the regulations and the laws around how we are going to conduct whatever we're going to conduct. Because even if we're doing good, we need to do it in a way that is considered acceptable and works with other things. I think that's actually, on some level, I must admit, I do find some sense of frustration in this. It's a little bit like, well, why can't we just do this? But these things do exist.
You just might get in trouble later.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about legislation is minimizing that trouble, if not avoiding it altogether.
And that's the part of these sorts of conversations and these explorations. I think so. For example, with legislation, there are certain sectors and industries and services that are heavily regulated and say you must be a ... if you're going to operate here. That's just it. You have to do that. For example, I worked a few years ago. I was working with a startup social enterprise who was going to get into the merchant services space. So merchant services, kind of debit card payment schemes. Because of how the legislation works around that, you have the legislation is very prescriptive about the legal form you can be. Has to be a company.
And similar.
That's it. That's how it goes.
And now, other things like giving legal advice or giving medical advice are very regulated for good reason.
Now with many choices, but the converse works as well. So, for example, under charity law, if the purposes that you define your social enterprise to be set up to be delivering are deemed to be wholly, here's the key word, and exclusively charitable in law, then the law requires you register it as a charity, nothing else. So I'm always when I'm working with a group or a community, and we can look at this question of form and what do you want it to be? How do you want it to work? How do you want to define it? If they've got to the point of saying, yeah, it shouldn't be charity. Now, I'm not kind of saying this in terms of trying to subvert the system or undermine the Charity Commission or anyone else. Then just tweak the wording a little bit. So it conveys that sense of pro-social, pro-community, but it's not the letter of the law charitable purpose. Because otherwise you can very easily find yourself getting caught saying, we thought we were trying to do the right thing here. And then there's this obscure act that says, oh, you should have done it this way. You're going to get hit with a stick now. And no one told you.
Yeah, and the tricky bit of this, each of these is separate things, is maybe maybe doable, but what we're looking for is actually something where all of these meet, or at least moving towards that situation where they're all satisfied, and that feels to me like the greatest challenge. It's easy to do one and then the other one goes out, and then it's a difficult thing to discover. So the next bit we're going to move into is your model, Adrian's own model for understanding and share it, and kind of helping us make these decisions and consider these factors in different ways, so that we can narrow it down to and narrow down the search for each of these areas, really, and decide on one. So before we do, though, is there anything else either of you would like to add about the decision factors, or should we move on?
Yeah, I just wanted to a little bit sort of maybe even sum it up in a sense that, again, there's most of the information in general, the descriptions are sort of online governmental site, or whether it's sort of legal structures in general. And that it's about the starting point, knowing what you have, what information you have, and starting to sort of read on the certain legal structures, and then sort of comparing it. Oh, is this meeting the needs or not? And sort of and then moving forward with it, seeing in what direction you need to go. And it's always that kind of keeping the values and your aims sort of as point of reference, but as well as you read more, you learn more, and you understand, okay, there's this out there, so what questions I need to ask. So yeah, really just I think what we've been speaking about, it is that sort of we are here to sort of offer some guidance in terms of maybe even an example of how to explore these topics, and really doing that too, and encouraging. I think that's probably what we're trying to say as well here, isn't it? Yeah.
So yeah, no, it's definitely a case of giving it a go and engaging with it. So with that in mind, let's move on to the champ model.
I think we should have had the sound effect of a drum roll for this part.
Really should have done. So yes.
We'll put it in the end later.
Next time.
So yeah, so first of all, what's this for? Why do we need this?
Well, we don't need it. This is
How
actually
does it help?
This helps me more than anything when I'm working with a group and the question about legal form comes up. Rather than start with, here's all the list, and this does this, this does that, and as you've both found, we don't know, is that good or bad? How does that help us or not? We don't know how to start to engage with it. Alternatively, we can look to those charts in terms of the research and mapping that's been done, but as we've already picked up, data can be biased and skewed, and it doesn't always help us relate to our story and our values and our identity and ethos. Or there's also things like flowcharts out there as well. DLA Piper and Unlimited have a publication out there. I think we'll reference it at the end. They've got a really nice, colorful little flowchart diagram. Start here, like yes, no questions, and takes you through. The problem with those sorts of online tools where it's a flowchart or a side-by-side comparison is other people have decided what the important questions are. And they're comparing each legal form against other legal forms. They're not helping you think about how do these forms help or hinder you work in the way that's important to you and your community and your ethos. And so what I started to do over the last almost 20 years now is start to look at all those different tools. When I'm having conversations like this, in my head, I've created a shortcut. So this is the way that I group all of those together to try and find an approach and 5 questions that I ask people to say, if you tell me what your ideal outcomes are against these 5 prompts, I can show you which legal form is best fit and why. And if you thought it was that other legal form, I can also show you why it's not on your terms. So rather than say, because this is about saying, well, you wanted to do like this, but actually that regulator means you'd have to do that instead. So this is about helping you define, and like you said, Anita, this is really boiling it down. So when you're navigating and exploring this for yourselves or sense checking what you've currently got, you know the questions to be asking. So, like I say, 5 domains, and the idea is we'll come under, touch upon each one briefly with kind of a quick hypothetical example, and then we'll kind of see where that takes us, if that's okay.
Absolutely, no, and I think that value, checking our assumptions is really the core thing here. It feels like, and the value of doing that at the outset, and then doing that as an ongoing process, is an iteration, and so we can always come back to the foundation and what's changed and what we've learned, and make sure that we're always orientated to things that we believe are true and are valued, rather than getting lost in all of the options and all of the potential out of there. So
we talked earlier about the idea of what's the business model for the social enterprise, and there's lots of frameworks and tools and templates for those, but none of them, I think, really speak to this idea of legal structure. It's simple, like, who's going to pay you? How do you let people know you're there? Nothing about managing risk, nothing about relationships, nothing about ethos and values and core identity. And this is hopefully part of that toolkit that people may find useful in terms of navigating the space.
From my perspective, if you don't get this bit right, however you successfully act afterwards isn't going to do what you want it to do. You can successfully execute failure. You can successfully do something that wasn't what you want at the outset.
There is no failure in social enterprise land, though. Remember, it's too important. No one ever talks about how they failed in social enterprise, so it can't happen. Even though it does, I think maybe that's a future kind of limited series thing about actually why do we find it so hard to talk about when we fail, when it goes wrong, and how we learn from that and encourage others to do it.
And I think that's a huge, that's a hugely valuable area, and I think in some sense, then, particularly as relates to what we're going to talk about right now, is if we talk about success, what our success looks like, which is one of the ways to look at what this is about. That also implies what our failure looks like and what we want to avoid. So it's both of those things, and understanding where we stand personally, with our different set of needs and our different perspective, probably in the case of most people who are setting this up compared to the conventional view, and how we relate to those personally.
Yeah, and I think as well how to overcome failure. Yes, I think that's very important as well. What tools do we need to sort of overcome? Because it's going to be part of the growth, as it always is.
So, dear listeners and viewers, if you'd love to see that as a follow-on limited series, please message us and let us know, and we'll figure out how to make that happen.
Definitely. So, shall we move to the first element of the model, which is credibility?
Credibility.
So, who do you want to impress?
I've tried to kind of create this as a relatively simple, straightforward set of prompts. One word, champ. Each letter is a different word or a theme, and we just unpack it a bit. So this first word, credibility. And some of these, as we go through, you're kind of, hang on a minute, didn't they talk about that 10 minutes ago in something else? And yes is the short answer, because the idea of this is to weave together all of those different aspects and considerations and approaches and data sets, everything else that kind of goes out there in a way that makes it more manageable to approach and get sense of. So credibility is about saying, who are the critical audiences to your enterprise? Who is it that when you present yourselves to them, they need to look at you and go, oh, okay, I get that. Let's move on to the next page. You don't have to explain, because I think maybe for example, as a commissioner in justice or health, most of me have an idea that a social enterprise should be a kick or a charity. So if you're neither of those, I'm already a bit confused. And that means you've got to spend longer helping me understand it. But that's made me uncomfortable because I now feel silly, and I don't like feeling silly. So I've pushed myself away from you. So there's something about this process of looking at options, which is if you know that there are key people or agencies or partners, before you make that final decision, involve them in the conversation. If nothing else, it will actually strengthen that future relationship as well.
Absolutely. And in my experience, working with large profit-making multinationals, is that some of those will only take you seriously if you're also a profit-making company. So it's not that any one model has more credibility in general necessarily. Is that it's very much related to what you're trying to say and how you're saying it as well.
So that's that kind of first question prompt, and all of these are quite open-ended. So that's the credibility part. Tick.
Great, and that's because the different legal forms can lend you different credibility in different domains,
depending on how they're understood or perceived by different people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I'm taking sort of notes because I know that in sort of the next episode we're kind of gonna look at on the example of the process we're trying to engage in. So this is very good.
Well, the next episode I'm actually a bit nervous because I actually have to do something quite clever, which is give you folks an answer with workings out. If this kind of limited series plays out as we're hoping it will. So
yeah, we're going to be doing live thinking in the next one, which is always a little bit more risky, but that's part of the fun of it. So
what could go wrong?
Yeah.
What could possibly go wrong? Exactly. And I think that actually this does relate to credibility. We're talking about exploratory stuff and finding stuff out. If we can't do that in public, then there's something kind of there's an element of that, and as relates to the structure and what it enables you to do. So
exactly, many things can go wrong, but what is the worst thing that could happen potentially? It's kind of always taking a step back, like actually being brave, going through with the process. Whatever comes. It is what it is.
And which kind of brings us to the next the next topic, which is history, and really the question about choosing things rather than choosing things on the basis of risk, as about choosing things whether they'll provide a good anecdote or not, which feels related.
And it's that question. So some people watching this, if you're watching this with any kind of background in marketing or branding, you'll be going, oh, I know about this. This is about your brand, your identity as a social enterprise, how people talk about you. So it's kind of an extension and overlaps with the question of credibility. And it's about echoing that ethos. So, for example, as we touched upon in episode 1, community interest companies were introduced by government as part of their policy agenda. So if you said, as a social enterprise, part of the way that we want to get out and create change and influence and connect is getting in that political system, being able to easily engage and have people then want to talk about us separately, then if we're a kick, for example, then all of those policymakers, those Whitehall boffins, when we've met them, will go, oh, we like you because you picked the legal form that we created for your sector. So we're more likely to probably relay your story on. Conversely, you may say, for example, that what we've seen as well in the broader church of social enterprise is community sport and football clubs. And social enterprise is coming to the rescue of football clubs who are going bankrupt. So the community comes together and says, we, the community, will take over our club. And not in a kind of a notional friendly way, we will become the shareholders. And that means we display our share certificate with pride in the kitchen. Football has a strange power like this for people and over communities that very few other things seem to do. So if we want people to be reminding themselves, strengthening that relationship, being that ambassador, the disciple for us, going out and proselytizing, if they've got a physical legal stake in the enterprise we've created, then that makes it easier for them. It's that kind of, well, of course I want to do that. I've got skin in the game, as it were. So that legal form, again, allows us to empower people who are connected with us to do it, to feel that they've got more reason to do it, or to be more passive and say, well, actually, no, we want to be something which is more about, we want to come and then go to the next place. We don't really want to leave too much of a footprint. We're more concerned with that change rather than people remembering our name and how that works through.
It feels related to belonging to me, and being able to, how are you inviting people in to participating, and how does that legal form relate to the modes of, the participation that you're offering? And how does it help you offer people the right way of participating? If we go back to the football club thing, it's like we understand the role of, why someone who was a fan of a club would want to have an influence over the way that the club worked. And that story makes sense, and the structure makes sense. So I think for me, there's something really interesting in that around, how do we reconcile those individual kind of needs and roles with the collective and with our story?
And it's almost that point of, who is the community that this social enterprise is rooted in? And should there be a defined community at all? Even for some, absolutely. For others, maybe not. But that's how we, ultimately we create change through stories. That's, legislation is built on anecdote and story that we share with each other. It's just that eventually those stories get shared with certain people who wear special clothes and bang gavels, and then it becomes a law and change happens. So there's something, how we can use our form to empower that community if it's right for us.
So, and I think this does very much relate then to the next bit, which is accountability. And who has a say in what we do? Because this is the other side of that, really. It feels like the flip side.
So who keeps us in check is another way of looking at this. And saying, so for example, the cooperative group. The biggest cooperative is the cooperative group as a society. It's the biggest cooperative business in the UK, one of the biggest in Europe, kind of figures in the global charts as well. It has a very clear social purpose in what it's trying to do. Every year, it sets out and says, we will campaign on certain social issues. And it has a mandate to do that because it goes to its millions of members and says to them, what should we do? What's the important things? And it then, when it goes out as a business to advocate on those issues, it says, we have the voice of this many people. This many people have mandated us to do this. And if we don't, then there are governance mechanisms, there are legal voting rights that they can have recourse to. That means they can change the structure of who's on our board, ultimately, to work that through. So that's a really powerful kind of check and balance that says we want to protect that purpose, that focus in perpetuity. So we create a structure and we give people that legal right. Now, on the flip side of that, we may say, well, actually, as a social enterprise, we're in a market. Now, for the cooperative group, that's fine. Retail, funeral care, those things are pretty, day in, day out. The kind of core businesses, they apply across everything. Our social enterprise is much more specific. We're a bit more niche. And we're in a changing marketplace. We need to be more responsive. We need to be more fleet of foot. We need, as a board, as the people leading it, to be able just to kind of change direction quite quickly. And the prospect that as a board, there's a body of other people who could destabilize that is too risky in terms of our purpose and how that mission works. That may be, if that's the case, okay. And so it's okay. So in that case, how do you make sure you've got that safety valve then that says, we're making sure then if we don't have a body of people over here to be our check and balance, who do we have instead? It goes back to that piece of credibility in history. How do people trust us? If we don't have a mechanism to show we are at risk of losing something if we don't uphold these standards and behaviors. In which instance, there are some groups who say we choose to become a kick for that reason. Because the kick regulator has the power to remove and appoint directors of their own choosing. Has the power to restrict future trading activities and to sue other people in the kick's name. And those kicks who become that form, actually some do it. Some become a kick precisely for those reasons. Because what they say is our business model says we have to be quite small. We can't have this bigger formal governance. But we need a reassurance, and particularly going back to that point about credibility as well at the start, when we engage in partnerships with others, this is what we can show them to assure them that we will stay on the straight and narrow path. That otherwise would be too big and expensive for us to manage, and would be too distracting from being able to develop the business model quickly enough in those marketplaces.
Sort of at the expense of flexibility.
So this is really about reconciling the kind of the constraints that we choose to place. It's finding helpful constraints, perhaps, that serve us in terms of our credibility. And I really like for me, I relate to this as like the rules. Don't like rules, but I really like the way you framed that in terms of both credibility and in terms of mandate, and being able to say, okay, we have this backing because we have these promises, we've made these promises, we have these requirements, we have these links, and using it that way, and using our accountability essentially, rather than seeing it as a limit.
Yeah, and kind of flipping at the other, so back to the football clubs and the cooperative model, the regulation then reflects that. So the FCA, who regulate cooperative societies, part of their check and balance when you put the returns in every year says, how have you engaged with the members? How have you responded to the members? We're here to protect the members' voice as a regulator. Your trading activity is there, but we're more interested in this point about membership, because that's who you have chosen to be accountable to. The kick regulator says, actually, that legal form, there's no requirement for there to be a membership that you're accountable to. So we're more interested in, have you played by the rules in terms of conflicts of interest, that directors haven't been accidentally being paid too much, that the trading activities are still relevant to your purpose, and we can step in on those things if we think they're going a bit off. So that kind of accountability piece is, and I kind of always emphasize this point, because so much that I see out there in terms of guidance and how other people explain this, no one ever seems to talk about the regulators. But if you're going to pick a legal form, you should know who you're going to be accountable to. The regulator is a line of accountability. So you should at least know what they expect of you in your legal form and what they can do to you if you don't satisfy that. And we see this across all sectors. So most private businesses that are struck off Companies House, so private businesses, there's a churn rate, there's a fair chunk of regular limited companies that are struck off. Companies House wade in and go, right, we're shutting you down. And the main reason that happens is because they don't put the paperwork in on time. Because no one explained to them, this is what the regulator's interested in. Are you keeping your forms and your administration up to date? Because that's the way Companies House safeguards and protects that you're doing things in the way that you should be as a company. And no one explains to them, this is what is going to happen to you if you don't. Companies House will shut you down and you'll be blocked from being a company director in the future.
So the question is sort of, who are you who are you accountable to legally? I guess that's the question. And I think you spoke a little bit before as well about the fact how important accountability really is, and if are trying to sort of apply for a grant or anything like that, they will be checking the accountability and really as well thinking about these questions as might have more options perhaps in terms of applying for grants if there's a better sort of accountability and better rules around that. So that is at expense of flexibility, but these are very important questions.
Yeah. And there's ways we can involve people's voices in those decision-making processes that are not legally based, that are more transient, more kind of happenstance. And that if that's appropriate, that's okay. But it's that question of, let's go to our community first in this exploring process and ask them, would you want to have a legal vote in how we run, or would you prefer to be part of a Facebook group and we have an open conversation every so often. Do you want that legal responsibility that comes with that vote, or would you prefer to be more in and out because of your own circumstances? Let's not make that assumption on other people's behalf.
And and I think, to bring it to the next point, this really relates to the guarantees, the promises we make to people when they offer us resources. When because that's ultimately what we're talking about, whether we're talking about customers or whether we're talking about grants or whether we're talking about whatever. We're implicitly making a promise to do something, deliver something, and what that where we expect that to come from is another big part of how we're going to decide.
Yeah, and there's something that's always my kind of crude analogy is what's you're thinking about grants. How critical will grants be to helping you set this thing up and sustain it in the future? And if the answer is very, then okay, so you're always going to have an ongoing grant dependency to keep this thing going. So let's look at a charity model then. Let's narrow it down and use that as a starting point. It doesn't guarantee, being a charity doesn't guarantee you will get awarded grants, but it increases your odds significantly against other legal forms. So that kind of helps that way. There's something saying though, or we could say actually, another question is, how do you feel about loans and debt? However you want to package it. And there's different ways you can do it with interest, without interest, and other clever models. But how do you feel about the concept about receiving a sum of resource that you will have to pay back at some point as part of that getting the wheel going, getting the thing in motion? Because if you think we'd be okay with that, then you've probably got a model that will trade at a surplus. That gives you more flexibility because grants restrict your choices in how you can spend it. Taking on a repayable sum, and then once you paid it back, you're still generating enough money clear to do other fun stuff with, gives you more flexibility and choices and responsiveness.
And the other option, obviously, in this space is essentially selling a chunk of the organisation, an interest in the organisation, selling equity.
Equity, yeah. This is I always call it the Dragon's Den model, where people say, I want 30% of your business. They mean 30% ownership, legal right to the profit, the assets, everything. Most social enterprises, as we see from the chart, can't offer that. They don't have the legal structure that allows equity, direct ownership, to be given to a private individual. But there are some that do. There are some out there doing that. And again, it's about that origin story that says if you're starting and you've got one or two wealthy individuals who are fortunate enough to have that resource lying around and they want to put it to good, and they're saying, the way that we want to do that with you is in this model, you have a choice. You take it, you create a form that allows you to receive that. You can bolt in lots of other safeguards and protections. So, for example, community interest companies will say you can have that model, and the regulator mandates how much profit they can have back in the future. They set a cap. So you can't, that's a non-negotiable. So that makes it easier to manage that relationship with those investors. Keeps it cleaner between you and them. It's not me saying this, it's the regulator. Okay, pass it back so you can focus on working the deal on the terms you prefer and you're happy with. And we've also seen as well in the past, so a few years ago we had an investment mechanism called social investment tax relief, which again was the idea of saying, if I'm going to invest or lend money to a social enterprise, I can get tax relief on that. So it makes it easier for me to justify putting that money into you on a very risky proposition. But it will only work if you are a certain type of legal form. Not all options count to do that with. Now, depending when you're watching this, social investment tax relief is about to not become a thing or used to be a thing. So if that's what it hinges on, don't do it. Similar as well in terms of it's in-kind resource as well. So for example, as a business rates, if we're taking on premises to run our enterprise from, there's this thing called business rates. It's another tax. It's the equivalent of council tax for businesses, except you don't get any benefit from it. It doesn't collect your bins from the offices or anything like that. But that's, anyway, it's by the by. And a lot of, I work with some groups who say, oh, we need to be a charity because we need to get business rate relief. We've costed it up. Being a charity gives you automatic exemption from a large chunk of business rates. Okay, fine. I would always counter that with that assertion and say, if your financial model is so precarious and fragile that it all hinges on getting business rate relief, anything else that comes along is going to knock you over. There's not a lot of financial resilience in that. So just think carefully. But again, the idea of this is it gives us those prompts to start those wider conversations and then bring it back to how will that form you adopt help or hinder you protect that ethos and that relationship and achieve those things in the future.
Absolutely. So bringing us on to the final one, which and again, I think all of these relate, but power and who is making the decisions here. What's influencing how we can act and what we do and all of these things and bringing that together.
And how important is it that they have a security of office, as it were, in terms of those people with authority? Should they have protected terms? Should they always be there for at least so many years? Should they be rotated out every so often? Should they have delegation? Should they be allowed to delegate authorities? Should there be a mechanism that says, actually, you can step back. You don't have to be hands-on. You can set it up that way. So for those of you listening and wondering, is it my tech that's kind of making a strange noise? It's my greyhound who's just rolling over in her sleep, having a bit of a whine.
So cute.
See, there's something about that decision making. Who makes the decisions? And again, like I say, Matthew speaks back to some of those earlier points. What's the basis on which they get that authority to make those decisions and have that control? And what safeguards do we want to put in place that allow us to challenge that if we think it's gone to their head a bit? It's time to help them shuffle on. We need a constructive challenge. Do we want a regulator who'll say, actually, no, that's the internal issue. We want to resolve those things ourselves. So, for example, the Charity Commission will say if there's a dispute between the trustees, the Charity Commission will go, well, that's an internal matter. Sort that out themselves. If we're a community interest company and we have a dispute amongst the trustees, then we can go to the regulator, and the regulator may say yes, because actually we can see that dispute is causing the KIC to place at risk the achievement of its objects and protecting its assets. So we'll step in and have the power to remove some of those trustees, so kind of resolve it. So how far do we want to have a structure that allows for those things to happen? Not to say they will. Just because you have the option doesn't mean it gets excised. But it's that idea of saying, what do we want to build in for the future as well? How do we future-proof this? And then back to that starting point, the credibility. How do we explain this chosen form to other people in a way that builds their confidence in what we're doing and how we're doing it?
So it's about choosing who is making which decisions, and where, at what level, and where, what the limits of that are, so that no one person can necessarily end up with too much power, but that we have the power necessary to do what we want to do in each role, and again for the function that we're trying to fulfill with the organisation.
And it's also about maybe separating out interests as well, and recognising that in some instances there'll be conflicting interests, and we want to not put people in a position where they're going to compromise themselves. So as we said earlier, in a charity, the executive, the management roles should not be the trustee, should not be the board. There's a clear separation of legal responsibility and relationship, and that's structured and regulated. In a company, you can be all the same. Yeah, and that's okay. That flexibility, and that may be more appropriate in that instance to work it that way.
I think this kind of a little bit goes back to what you said about protecting that social voice, and what are the measures there to sort of protect that.
Yeah, I think power and protection are two sides of the same thing. I think that's another very useful way to frame this conversation about it and think about this thing in a slightly different way. So when we're using this model, I just wanted to kind of bring together all of the different bits that we've said, and you know, it's a tool of many to choose a form that works for you, and to become confident but not necessarily dead certain that it's the right model. It's also a tool for explaining your decision to others, which may actually be a very important part of the whole process and a big valuable thing. If you can explain why you've chosen all of this structure in clear terms, you're much more likely to get the trust and support of other bodies and other people. And finally, it's an iteration and improvement thing. It's not a fixed thing. So it might change over time, and you can use it to reflect back in future. So that's kind of the whole breadth of using this tool. Are there any more tips or anything quickly that you'd like to add for people to use this?
Your responses to each of those prompts will change over time, and that's normal. And as a result, when you do that, just go back and check. And actually, what I always say, if there's a group of you doing this together, all of you, so I'd have this conversation like this with you, and then I'd say to you, right, your homework is to go off separately and to jot down what you think are the most important responses under each of those headings. And then we'll compare them, because some of this, for each of you separately, is so obvious. It's so central to you. We don't need to say that. It's really obvious and clear. But actually, it's just sanity checking it to make sure that when you come together as a body of entrepreneurs, the people who are collectively going to share responsibility for this thing, you've got that assurance and confidence in each other and your relationship that you've understood each other's starting points. It's allowed you to have that awkward conversation that you wouldn't know how to best approach having together otherwise.
Yeah. And so say we've someone's been listening to this and gone, yeah, that's great, but I really need to I need to decide by the end of today.
Yeah. Okay.
What do you do?
That's easy. In terms of, if you need something quick, a company limited by guarantee. On the basis that out of all the incorporated options, it's the quickest to register. It can be done within 24 hours. It's the cheapest in that regard as well. It's the most flexible in that you can adapt its governing document to entrench those acid test social enterprise characteristics. Looking after it, the regulator who oversees it, as long as your paperwork's up to date, you can pretty much carry on. As long as it's legal, clarify that point, keep it legal, keep it up to date, that's fine. In terms of financing, there are a lot of grant making bodies who will look on a company limited by guarantee and go, that's fine. The Lottery, Tudor Trust, Esme Fairbairn, others like that, that's okay, because there's no private ownership, there's no shares involved. And if you want to change it to something in the future, you can put it to the KIC regulator to become a KIC, or you can take it to the Charity Commission to become a charity. So it gives you them, out of all those options, it's the easiest one to put out there, the easiest one to look after, and the most flexible for going out in the future. And maybe that loops us back to where we started with Social Enterprise UK's chart, which is, this could be why most people pick this, because they needed something in a hurry and said, what's the easiest and quickest to set up, and what's the most flexible in the future? This is it.
Absolutely. So if we're just to kind of bring all of this together and what we're considering, when we're thinking about this and thinking about all of these things, there's kind of three big topics, or three dimensions around when we're actually thinking about what we're trying to do is what effect do we actually want to have, or are we planning to have? How big and for how long? Because every different organization is going to be doing things on a different scale, a different time scale, and going to be doing different things. And I think understanding these and what does success look like for us, for us as founders, us as a community, and what do we want out of this in these terms, feels like using all of these tools to actually start to understand that and to be able to articulate that.
Definitely. And I think there's something about that sense of the effect, scale, and length of effect. Some people would say that the easy answer to all of that is we change legislation. We lobby policymakers and the legislative to say that creates that small change on those bits of paper, but that impacts upon the way everyone lives and thinks and has to behave. The problem with that is you can't do that if you're a charity or a kick.
Yeah.
You're legislatively barred from lobbying parties. But that doesn't mean you can't try and create influence in other ways. So that point of what does success look like for you also goes back to how do those different options help or hinder you to achieve that?
Absolutely. So if you want to find out more, we've got more resources for this. There's Adrian's blog, which is, as we mentioned in the first episode, there's lots of stuff there, kind of thoughts and commentary and assessment of different things. There's the document that we mentioned earlier, which includes the decision-making flowchart, which is structures for social enterprise. And
I just kind of say, in terms of that second one, because last week we kind of shared about Simply Legal. The reason we put this one in this week, it's not the only flowchart diagram out there you can find on the net. I think, for me though, I think it's the one that's written in the most colourful and easy to follow way. So it's visually much more appealing than some of the others.
That's great. I think having read quite a lot of dry documents that are a wall of text, that's definitely to be commended. So it is all about this cross-referencing and getting different approaches, isn't it?
Definitely.
And so that brings us to the end of today. And we've given you lots of technical detail and lots of stuff to think about in the last 2 episodes, and hopefully a framework for coming to those decisions. If you're at all like me, though, I really help, like practical examples really, really help me understand this stuff and actually relate it to real life. So in the 3rd and final episode, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be applying all of this to the social enterprise that Anita and I are setting up, called Curious Being. So I'm particularly looking forward to this bit, though I think it's going to be a lot more exploratory and a lot less directed. But that's my preferred kind of thing. Anyway,
it's also where I'm really properly going to have to put my thinking cap on.
Exactly. Yes, we're all going to have to. I think
lighting up every single part of it's going to be happening.
Yeah. I mean, as well, I'm looking forward to it, and thank you, Adrian, thank you, Matthew, for today as well. Sort of maybe this time a little bit was sitting back and really taking some notes and thinking about, what it might mean for me and Matthew setting it up, and I think it's a good thing as well for the viewer maybe to go through these things, have these questions, and in episode 3 really go through it, reflect. Okay, what does that mean for me? And I just wanted to add as well a little bit, that what it means really to be a human being and setting this all up, and it's definitely not an easy thing, and it does involve the stress and self-doubt, and that it's very okay. And I sometimes like to use the phrase, well, just have doubts, have fear, but keep doing it anyway, and that's okay.
Better to regret the stuff you've done than always lie there in bed at night going, oh, I wish I'd done that, or hearing other people and being jealous and thinking, oh, I should have done that, I could have been a contender. But like I said, when that anxiety is ramping up, it can be really hard to push through that sometimes.
And I think using these frameworks and using these tools as a way to work with that rather than find it overwhelming is a really, really helpful way of looking at it. So I'm looking forward to really getting into that, and I hope you in the audience will join us for the 3rd one. And because in many ways I think it will be learning a different set of things, and I'm expected to learn a lot from that one. So thank you very much, Anita and Adrian, and we'll see you again at the end of the week.
Okay.
Goodbye.